All right, so hi everyone, my name is Carolyn. I'm stepping in for Sam today. He had some conflicts, so he couldn't make it today. Also, Fred will be helping me out as we just, we're your MCs for this meeting. We're volunteers with the Vancouver Security Group. Normally, if we were in person, we would go around the room and have everyone introduce themselves because we're very, I like to think we're a very fun, friendly group, and so we're always trying to get more people to meet each other. But for now, we'll just go through first few notes before the meeting. First note I should mention for everyone who's used to us, normally we have our AGM for this September, but our president had some conflicts for this month, so it'll be next month. Please reach out to us if you have anyone interested in volunteering. We're a pretty small group, but we're a lot of fun, so we appreciate if there's anyone interested in assisting or leading in any of the positions, so just reach out to us. Next is an open call for job openings, actually. So we normally post these on our website. There's a couple posted recently, but does anyone have anything they're interested in sharing? Or you can post a note in the chat if anyone had a note that they wanted to post in the chat or any links. Silence. Okay, I'll assume no then. But if you do need to, just reach out to us. Just let us know that we normally accept, anybody who's interested in posting a job on our website. Next thing,
Carolyn, before we leave jobs, we have opened the job posting Slack channel. And anybody who wants to contact Orvin about job postings, he will be putting appropriate postings on our website as well. And there's Orvin.
Yeah, so yeah, thanks, Rob. So yeah, we've had the job postings channel on the Slack workspace for quite some time, and I noticed that people are posting jobs opportunities there, from time to time. There were a number of I guess employers who had because they're actually not VanSecSIG members, were continuing to email me to put job postings on the Slack channel as well as on our website. So that seeing that I'm just basically a roadblock at times, yeah, because things get busy, right? So it's just saying, here, why don't we give you access to our Slack channel, and you can post directly. Why better that you come directly from you guys than me trying to basically act as a funnel. So I haven't actually seen anyone join taking me up on that offer, even though they replied by email saying, hey, that's a great idea. So I haven't seen anyone new join the channel, but anyways, well, we'll see if things change. But yes, everyone's welcome to post their opportunities on that channel at any time, and hopefully some of the people that used to email me will now be directly posting. So yeah. Since I have the floor, Carolyn, do you mind if I just, since in Ryan's absence, maybe I'll just talk about the CPEs quickly?
Yeah, that would be perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, so yeah, since I have the floor already, so to speak. So when it comes to CPEs, like we, because we are an IC² chapter, Ryan Liu, our membership director, has essentially, been submitting the names of all the attendees so that CPEs are automatically claimed for these meetings. So if you've been getting them in the past, you can, and you are on the attendee list for this meeting, then you can expect to have them again for today. I mean, they do take a while to appear on your record because IC² is like any bureaucratic organization, isn't going to be the fastest in getting that done. But essentially, so he will continue to do that because we do get a membership list from Zoom or attendee list, I should say. That's assuming that he has your CISSP number. So if you are new to this meeting and you do want to claim CPEs, please make sure that you provide your CISSP ID. Put it on the Slack channel or email Ryan directly or contact me, and we will try and make sure that you get your CPEs. So that's all. Thanks, Carolyn.
Yeah, awesome. Actually, I would like Fred to take the floor next because I don't have the external events, the recent ones that were posted.
I do.
Fred, I think you had a note of this. Awesome.
Yeah, and in addition to what Arvin said, you can also post your ISC Square member number in the chat, on the Zoom chat. It gets recorded, so we can pass that back to Ryan also. In terms of events, I've got a couple of them. So VanSecSIG is trying to start up again. So the next planned session should be on September 21st. Not many details yet. That should be security awareness lessons for Dr. Bonnie Henry by the Excellentissime Rob here present. We've got also a global 3-day virtual conference happening at the end of the month. It is sponsored by COSAC, C-O-S-A-C. This is their 28th annual information security conference, virtually 28. I think they have an issue because they write 28-20 September 2021 for 3 days. That's pretty long. So it's the end of the month. You can go to cosac.net/NAAS and they have all the details. We have, besides Calgary, also October 21st and 22nd, $50. It's fully virtual as well. We've got the Virtual Security, Cybersecurity and Fraud Summit in London, ISMG events. I don't have the details yet. It is on ISMG events. I will try to post that into the Zoom chat shortly after. And I think that's all for now.
Awesome, thank you. Does anyone else have any other events to add? Oh, go ahead, Rob.
Yep. He mentioned besides Calgary in October, besides Edmonton is a little bit sooner. They are September 23rd and 24th, I believe. And just one other thing, we've mentioned, discussed in various places, trying to do a combination of my security lessons from COVID-19 and a one-day CISSP seminar. There does seem to be some interest in doing this sometime in October, if that's possible. And by possible, I mean, getting a venue and getting permission to do something with actual people there. Although there is also some interest in doing it as a kind of a hybrid, an on-site and online thing. So if anybody's interested in that, I guess contact me or James, and we'll see what goes from there.
And if anybody else had any events to post, or feel free to speak up if you wanted on the call. And feel free to send us notes as well, and we can add them to the website, and I'll try and get that updated with the most recent ones as well. So that leaves, I think that's everything for the preamble. So I think, yeah, I can introduce our speaker then, unless something else came up or forgetting something, Fred?
I think we're all good for now.
Okay.
Awesome.
Before I introduce the speaker, let me just jump in and let me talk about the future events, our events. So in October, we have someone who is going to talk about Shoulders of InfoSec project. Pretty much he'll be talking about those giants in information security. I'm sure the history of that will be an interesting topic. And I have speakers for the next few months, but if there are some people who are interested in speaking, please get in touch with me. I'll put my contacts in the chat, and I'll schedule for the next coming few months.
Awesome, sounds good. And thank you for the notice. I'll try and put it up soon. So then introducing our speaker for today, Walter Williams, who will be speaking about measuring how well companies are managing information security. Just from reading your bio, Walter, it sounds like you've been through a very cool myriad of different security firms, different companies. You've spoken at different conferences like B-Sides and DEFCON. And you've recently written a new book, which is coming out, it sounds like, next week. So welcome, thank you for being here. Feel free, please take it away.
It is a pleasure to meet you all, albeit virtually. And I'll warn you now, I'm a New Yorker by birth, and so I can talk a little quickly. If I'm talking too quickly, please somebody speak up and say, slow down, you old fool, and I will do my best to slow down. This is actually an expanded edition of the talk that I gave at the Security Leaders Village at DEF CON this past summer, and is an expansion on the talk that I'll be giving next week at an event that you did not mention. The Cloud Security Alliance is having their September event in Seattle, just a hop, skip, and a jump away from where you're all located, next week. And I'll be speaking a condensed version of this talk there on September 15th. It's an in-person event, and that's going to be interesting in this troubled time. So anyway, let's take it away. Measuring your risk management. First of all, about me, you've already introduced me, and I'm not going to speak much about myself. Yes, I have 2 books. Yes, I blog. Yes, I have a LinkedIn profile, and I very much welcome anybody who wants to connect either on LinkedIn or Twitter. And yes, that is my email address. I got into Gmail early enough where I could actually have a branded email. I am so elite. And I've been doing information security stuff for over 20 years and have an IT career that's 15 years older than that. So that's me, and a quick agenda. First of all, if you're going to be measuring the success of information security, what you're really doing is measuring how well you're doing risk management. So it behooves ourselves to take a step back and look at what is risk so that we can measure it. Can we learn anything from the various standards that we have regarding either risk or metrics? And how to bring measurements together in order to create metrics. The things that you report on when you measure controls that manage specific risks. And then we'll take a look at some relevant metrics. We'll look at visualizing numbers and perhaps some balanced scorecards, if I remember to put in those slides. Because I've been burning the midnight oil to get this monstrosity of a slide deck put together. Alrighty, so what is risk? Risk is not impact times likelihood. That's just bad math. By the way, you will see that I'm irrelevant. You'll see that I'm unorthodox and extremely opinionated. That's just me. Rob and David are used to that. If you're not used to that, well, sorry, that's who I am. Okay, risk, there's an actual standard out there now that's a bit younger than 27005, which is the only other place where I've seen risk fairly well defined. But risk is the probable frequency and the probable magnitude of future harm. That comes from the Open Group Standard based on what Jack Jones and Jack Freund created when they created FAIR. And you notice that those are independent factors. They are not aggregated by some funky math that takes apples and multiplies them by oranges in order to get grapefruit, which never works. And it's kind of important that they be 2 independent factors if you're going to be making decisions off of them, because if you try to do an impact times likelihood bit of nightmare, what you get is bad decision making, because likelihood or probability or whatever you're defining here for event frequency, if you will, is always a percentage. And so in essence, what you're doing when you're multiplying it by your impact by that is you're shrinking the amount of your impact by a fraction. So let's say that you have an impact of $10 million and you have a probability of 10%, you now think that you have a risk of $1 million, which is BS. You have a risk of $10 million potential impact with an event probability of 10%. And multiplying them just shrinks the value of that and makes you, how shall I say, a laughingstock when you bring this to your senior executives and the board of directors. So abandon that, please. Okay, now there are 7 basic risks, not 3, not 9, there are 7. You can argue that, no, Walter, you're full of it. There's a lot more here. Well, what I'm saying is that these are cyber risks, and I'm doing meta-categorization. These are the basis of where you start with your scenarios. And yes, I am pushing us to abandon confidentiality, integrity, and availability as the cornerstones of our what we do in information security. They are not sufficient. You also need utility, authenticity, control, and privacy. And if the past few years haven't convinced you of that, let's take a look at them a little carefully. So why do we need authenticity when you have integrity? Does anyone remember what happened with SolarWinds this past January? That was an attack on the authenticity of a patch. You had no defense against it because you had no risk model against it, because you had never thought to worry about authenticity. Because doesn't integrity, confidentiality, and availability defend everything? Hell no. And so when an unauthentic patch was offered by SolarWinds, how many organizations got owned? Too many. I believe it was 10,000. Attacks against authenticity are the new big thing. They are not going away anytime soon. And most of us don't have a good defense against this sort of thing. We have to depend upon our vendors having a defense against it. And, they probably don't. It's never good to depend upon somebody else doing the right thing. What about control when you have confidentiality? I can well remember a certain unnamed vendor that used to spat out how encrypt everything, it solves all your problems. Yeah, somebody encrypted it for you, but because you're not in control of the encryption keys, it solved no one's problems because you're worried about encryption. And maybe they already encrypted data on you, but a ransomware attack is essentially an attack on control of access to that data. They've stolen control from you. Unless you pay them a small fortune or have good backups, you can't easily get that control back. And if you want to pay the ransom, well, God bless you. You're a fool who's easily parted from your money and may not see that data again, even if you pay the ransom. I believe it's something like 30% get their data back when they pay. So ransomware attacks succeed because they are attacking something you don't have a defense against. What about utility? Well, this is the one that's probably weakest of everything that Don Parker proposed. But just think about your customer support staff when your site monitoring shows that the site's up, but your customers are screaming, I can't use it, because you're suffering a denial of service attack that doesn't take it down. It just slows it down to the point where you can actually pay attention to what this Walter bloke is speaking because he's been slowed down. Your customers notice. This is something you should be defending against. The risk here is probably the least impactful, potentially. I don't know. I'd have to sit down and calculate that myself. Of course, customer satisfaction and customer loss is a pretty impactful event. What about privacy? I presume that with all the different laws about privacy, you might have realized that privacy needs to be added to confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And no, just guaranteeing the confidentiality of things does not guarantee you anything regarding privacy. First of all, with privacy comes from the fact that we were a bunch of horses' asses that thought that protecting our corporate assets was sufficient when it never was. We need to protect data that we don't own, that we are custodians for, that is owned by somebody else, our customers, perhaps, our business relationships. And by the way, when you collect an IP address and a date and timestamp, you can readily identify who did what. There was a great talk at DEF CON that identified members of parliament who were downloading interesting forms of pornography back a few years ago, just based upon their IP addresses and the date timestamp of what folks were able to gather over the internet, without, by the way, being the porn provider. They were doing this by looking at other data. So that's pretty nasty violation of privacy that you don't get from encrypting anything. All right. So now that you know that risk is more than just risk to confidentiality, integrity, and availability, what is a metric and how does it differ from a measurement? Well, look at me for a moment. How many kilograms do you think I am? I have no clue. I can tell you in pounds. But I'm an American. I have no clue when it comes to kilograms. What I can tell you is I'm 200 pounds. Now, that's a measurement. I don't know if that's a good amount or a bad amount. Um, how many pounds am I over my goal weight? Well, 10 if you really must know. So I've got 10 pounds to lose. I think that's approximately 20 kilograms if I do the math correctly. But that's a metric. It's a difference between where I want to be and where I am today, or the difference between reality and the goal. And so you have to know what you want out of your controls in order to have metrics. You can easily measure what they do, and measurements are wonderful. But if you don't know what the desired state is, you will not be able to have a metrics program because you won't be able to measure against desired state. Now, understanding what controls do what is exactly what our standards give us. The trouble is that our standards don't give us things that help us identify much more than what protects confidentiality. There's next to nothing in the NIST standard, if you care, that helps you understand what defends integrity. There's very, very little in the CIS-CSC that helps you understand what defends availability. And frankly, I'd have to say about 80% of our industry is all geared around protecting against data breaches. And you hear it from the vendors, you hear it from the service providers, you get all sorts of these data breach reports here, data breach reports there, data breach reports everywhere. But when was the last time you saw a report about an impact to integrity? And while there used to be some vendors that produced reports regarding denial of service attacks, you don't find them being issued on a periodic and regular basis. Matter of fact, it's kind of hard to find them on anything other than an ad hoc every now and then basis. Our industry's forgotten about 2/3 of what we claim to worry about, and nevertheless, the other 4 things that we ought to be worrying about. So as we take a look at our control standards, understanding what protects what is actually rather difficult to do and requires a lot of critical thinking on our part. Now, in order to understand what your risks are, you have to design, I said that wrong. Once you understand what your risks are, you design controls around to manage them. And metrics is how you know if the controls are effective. And what you do is that you aggregate up the metrics regarding the appropriate controls for the risk to understand if you are managing risk effectively. That's what a metric is an aggregate of an analysis of the appropriate controls. Great, we're done. Let's go. Now, actually, I've got a lot more to say on the subject. So let's take a look at what we can learn from our different standards. Now, of the existing published standards, there are 4 holistic frameworks that have things about metrics. We've got 27.4. We've got CIS-CSE 7. 8 metrics will be out soon. We've got SP 800-55 Rev 1. And we've got the CSA Star Alliance. Again, this is coming very, very soon. And it's to be used in continuous certification. We've got 4, about to be 5, sorry, no, 3 about to be 4 published set of metrics that, or guidelines to producing metrics we can use. If you're using the trust services criteria, you're a full, yes, I said that out loud, and there are no metrics there. There's no metrics in PCI DSS, nor do they want metrics in the NIST cybersecurity framework. And when you talk to the authors about metrics, they look the other way shyly. And finally, there are no metrics in COVID. All right. 27.4 is a 68-page standard on measurements. It gives you 35 candidate measurements with 2 different kinds of metrics coming from that. SB 855 is an 80-page standard on performance measurement for information security with 19 candidate metrics and 3 different kinds of metrics. The CIS-CSC condenses theirs down to 24 pages as a measurement companion to the standard, but they give you 177 metrics. Isn't that wonderful of them? Because there's a one-to-one relationship between their controls and their metrics or measurements. And so that's where the state of the literature is today. Now, within SP 855, there are 3 things that you measure. You measure, is the control effective at doing what you want to do? Is the control completely deployed? And that's extremely important to understand. And has the control had an adverse impact on your organization? And that's a beautiful, wonderful thing to be asking. Now, ISO asks the first 2 questions. CIS-CSC only asks about if the control is completely deployed. So I would recommend that you start with using NIST's 3 things to measure as your guidelines for where to start and go from there. By the way, my neighbors, landscapers, have just arrived. And so if you hear a very, very loud buzz in the background, that's industrial strength lawnmowers attacking the growth of my neighbor's lawn. And I'm so thrilled that this is happening on a Friday at 5:26 here on the East Coast, where I'm located. All righty, let's see if I can talk over that. I hope you're not hearing it. Completeness, this is what the CIS-CSC hangs their hat on. And you certainly will be less effective in what you're doing if you haven't deployed a control completely. So yes, we should start here. And all you have to do is count. And then you count how close you get to 100%. And if it's really close, you're doing damn good. And if it's not so close, you're doing less than wonderful. And about 1/3 of their metrics are based upon, yes, you've either done it or no, you haven't, because there are some things you can't count. .4, however, gives you a much better view into how you put a metric together from measurements than this does. So I'm going to focus in on what they're doing here. And if you work from the bottom up, you start out with data. And data needs a context in order to become information. And so you start putting that context together with a measurement method to get to a base measurement.
In New York?
I'm actually just outside of Boston, if you must know. In terms of where I'm located today, but I didn't quite hear the entire question because I've got this loud drone of lawnmowers going on. Could you repeat the question?
Okay.
It was something about New York, but I didn't hear what. Okay. Not hearing the question reissued, I'll just go forward and convinced that I've utterly lost the audience who's now worried about New York City. I wonder what happened there. Okay, so you develop a measurement method to take a look at either is it 100% deployed, or is it effective, or is it having an adverse impact? And that gets you a base measurement. And they'll, we've already discussed 3 different things we're measuring about each control. So you bring those together, 2, 3, or more, into a function that gives you a derived measurement. And perhaps then you do some analysis of this in order to get an indicator of how well things are going. And then you as the human have to get involved in this at some point and do some interpretation of the numbers. Is this going in the right direction? Is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? Do we have an emergency problem that needs to be addressed here and now? And you produce a result, preferably in a story. So that's a really lovely way of describing how metrics are created. Let's take a look at some things that you have to pay attention to. Starting with who's doing all of this. You want as few people possible in the creation and the the creation and the computation process, but you do need humans involved in the analysis. Computers don't make good decisions based upon human-oriented goals. You want the measurements as much as possible to be collected automatically. You want them to be hopefully placed into a format where that can be analyzed easily. And hopefully the analysis at least can be done by software, but sometimes you'll need the analysis to be done by people. So if you're going to be serious about metrics, you need to staff appropriately, or at least understand how much extra work you're giving yourself. Now, goals from risk. You can work to reduce your impact. You can try to reduce your event frequency. When you reduce impact, you're actually reducing the material risk that you're suffering at the moment. When you reduce event frequency, you are reducing how often you endure that material risk. Now, if you do things right, you'll never experience the material risk. So reducing event frequency can reduce how much impact you actually have, but that's a harder thing to guarantee. And we've all seen how efforts to do that fail. It's pretty much guaranteed, however, that you have a fast and effective response to whatever gets through those controls. The faster the response, the smaller the impact on your organization. And that's great to know. And it's why you need to have the two kinds of orientation within your organization and its controls. Now, Win Schwartau, and if you haven't read his book, I highly encourage you to do so. Analog security is awesome. He likes to define effective security as a problem of time. How quickly you respond and stop an attack relates to how bad the impact is. And by the way, all the other controls, what they're effectively doing is increasing the amount of time it takes before the impactful event happens. They don't stop the impact. So the preventive controls are also putting in a factor of time here. So we have time before the impact begins. That's your preventive controls. Then you have time post incident begins. Those are your detective and reactive controls. So a very good metric here is time to detect plus time to react. Now, as you're measuring that, you want to measure it between upper and lower limits. You have to understand that you're measuring against the cycles of your microprocessors, even if you're in the cloud. That's just somebody else's computer. So the smallest limit that you have is 2 cycles of the microprocessor, the time to detect and the time to react. That's your lower limit. The upper limit, of course, is infinite. That can be as long as it takes. And all controls do, I'm just going to say this again and again and again. When you have a control to protect confidentiality, all you're doing is slowing down the attack and increasing the amount of time that you have to detect the attack in progress. And those are 2 very valuable things. That's all your preventative controls do, is give you time. Now, with that understood, let's look at a meaningful metric. And to make things easy on us all, I'm going to build one off of a data set that we can all examine at our heart's content. And yes, I'm going to look at compromise of confidentiality as the specific risk scenario I'm going to construct. So let's take a fairly realistic one based upon the data that's in the various database. So confidentiality being compromised through the compromise of credentials of an account that had access to this information because the person who's custodian for that account clicked on a phishing link that stole the credentials. And you could say, but I have multi-factor authentication. And I can say, that's very nice. But did you know that multi-factor authentication doesn't prevent against this attack? Just ask the dear folks at Twitter how well their multi-factor authenticated prevented the phishing attack that impacted them. Phishing it succeeds so wonderfully because it is the best implementation of the system in the middle attack that we all talk about as theoretically being very bad. And the only way to prevent it is to use strongly authenticated encryption, which how many of us actually use? I think if I asked everybody to raise their hands at the moment, I would see raised hands of 0. I'm hoping I'm wrong. So since we're not putting in place the actual preventative control, this is a realistic scenario that could impact us all, despite our wonderful multi-factor authentications. So the controls we're actually measuring here are manifold, and they are both preventative and detective and responsive. So we'll look at spam filtering, obviously, URL filtering, DNS filtering. Multi-factor authentication is definitely a control here. User behavior analysis, source to destination firewall rules, source to destination bandwidth management. You see an attack in progress, to shrink the bandwidth, you'll limit the amount of data that can go out. You're seeing your SOAR, your NDR, whatever it is that you're using for monitoring and I hope response, automated response, and or if you have it and it actually works, your DLP solution. Yes, I have run DLP solutions in the past, and I've never encountered one in my brief 57 years of life that actually did what was paid for. I'd love to see a scenario where it did something, but that's just me. Now, when you're setting up your goals, you want to make your goals as shiny and pristine as possible. No, your goals should not be necessarily realistic, but if you want to make these numbers bigger than 0, that what you're doing is here, you're representing in your goals your tolerance for risk baked into your measurements. And I would argue that that's a wonderful thing to understand, is what is your risk tolerance. But when you're going to be reporting this to your senior executives, to your board of directors, perhaps what you want to do is represented against what our ideal state is, and discuss how the amount of events that get through is in your risk tolerance. But because it's more than 0, you're still doing things to improve things. I think that tells a more honest story when you talk to your senior executives, when you talk to your board of directors, than saying, oh, my goals are not 0. I'm not even trying to be perfect. I'm admitting to failure from the start. And I'll go in front of my senior executives and I'll go in front of my board of directors with my tail between my legs, because I'm never trying to get to the ideal state. Now, I may never get here, but I'm an ISO 27001 proponent. So I always look for, how can I improve? So yes, I may never get here, but I'm always going to strive for it. All right, so with spam filtering, I have 0 fishes delivered. With URL filtering, 0 bad URL clicks are reached. With DNS filtering, 0 bad hosts are reached. It's the same thing as URL filtering through the spam filtering, but different. My goal for multi-factor authentication, 0 authorized connections from unknown hosts. My goal from user behavior analytics, that I have 0 actions that deviate from historical trends. They've never tried to reach that server before, I should know that. My goal from source to destination bandwidth management, that I can have reduced bandwidth to unknown hosts that are suddenly involved in my traffic. I can have a goal that I have a source to destination firewall rules where I have 0 connections attempted to unknown hosts. And of course, the DLP pie in the sky goal of no data written to unknown hosts. All right. Obviously, I'm describing utopia here, but let's look at the incident response side of utopia. 100% of the events are monitored. Great goal. 100% of alerts are actionable, a much better goal. You don't want to be getting alerts that just flood your analysts with something's happening and you can't do anything about it, but I'm going to wake you up every 2 hours because something's happening. I was a victim of that kind of alert philosophy in a prior job. It cost me my health for the rest of that month, and it cost them an employee very quickly thereafter. Don't do that to your employees. 100% of your alerts are true positives. Oh, that is a noble goal. You should be striving for that. You don't want false positives if you can avoid them. You all might always have them, but strive to get past that. 100% of your alerts are responded to within your SLA. Extremely important goal. Remember, security is a time-bound problem, so define your SLAs carefully. 100% of your responses are proportional to the event. You don't want to block Amazon because an IP address within Amazon attacked you. Even if the attack is viral and real and impactful, you could be cutting off your nose to spite your face there. Have a proportional attack or a proportional response. And finally, when you do have an incident and you track your postmortems, you want to make certain that 100% of the postmortem action items are actually worked to resolution. So you want to follow up on those things. And yes, you measure all of that. These measurements need to be aggregated through an algorithm that helps you know if you're managing risk through either reducing the frequency of events over time, or when an event happens, it is short-lived. And since you have controls that do both, you report on both. You're well on the journey to metrics just by aggregating those measurements together regarding that one single risk that we have identified so far. Now, we also need to look at the dark side of what we're doing with our controls. Any one of these things can have an adverse impact. Start with spam filtering. We don't want to be blocking legitimate emails. 2 companies in a row, that's been my biggest problem with spam filtering, is not letting the bad stuff through, it's stopping the good stuff. Having contracts in negotiation blocked because they look like spam is the last thing you want to be dragged to the table to explain. URL filtering, you don't want to be blocking legitimate URLs. You don't want to be blocking access to legitimate hosts. Tune these things. You don't want to have any authorized connections blocked with your multi-factor authentication. With user behavior, that's a nicer, fluffier goal, but you want 100% of your behavior to be normative. If you know what that means, and I'm not certain any of us do. Source to destination bandwidth management, well, you want no bandwidth reduction to authorized hosts. Source to destination firewall rules, that you want to permit 100% of your legitimate traffic. And finally, with your DLP system, if you have one, that the data being written to known hosts is authorized and permitted 100% of the time. Very clear ways of set, or very clear goals, right? Hopefully attainable goals to reduce the impact of our security controls upon our organizations. Say much with the same, and here we're looking at a different kind of impact for some of them. So we don't want our systems becoming full because we're collecting logs. You don't want any systems hard drives filling up. You don't want any of your network devices flooded because you're logging. I had a fun time explaining how we shut down the entire network at our company because we turned on logging syslog over TCP instead of syslog over UDP. Yes, we guaranteed that 100% of the logs arrived. Goal achieved, yay! At the cost of flooding our entire network because the vendor's switches that we were using and the vendor's firewalls that we were using to carry this can't handle sending out all the logs they collect over TCP, which, by the way, is laughable. And yes, this is one of the big vendors in this space. And if you want to understand their name, find me at an in-person event over a beer or two, and I will tell you under a handshake NDA. All right. You don't want any of your analysts burnt out from alert fatigue. That's one of the root causes why the target data breach happened is because they had alert fatigue. The other reason and the real root cause of that is they didn't have separation of networks, something mandated by PCI DSS. Everybody always talks about other things, how this happened, but everybody forgets about that one. You have 0% of automated responses, interrupting legitimate authorized business. And this is why for seems like centuries, people were afraid to turn on the IPS functionality of their IDS systems. They were afraid of shutting down legitimate business. We can't be afraid. We have to take risks here, if you will, of having this adverse impact by doing it carefully. And yes, by the way, this is, if this happens, you have an impactful event caused by what you're doing. That's an actualized incident. That's very much business risk. You want 0% of your responses to be undocumented. Oh, that's a very key measurement. And you want 0% of your responses to be irreversible. My favorite story of the DevOps world is the company that basically automated themselves out of business. You don't want to do that to yourself. Now, analysis, great. Where we know what our measurements are, we know what our goals are, how do we analyze them to get information from the data, putting it in the right context. So you can do things such as, what's the standard deviation from the norm? And you want that to be a fairly small number. You want to take a look at what percentage of your controls perhaps are more than 5% from their goal and how that changes over time. Yes, you can look at the average, but I would argue looking at the mean or the average is the wrong thing to be doing. Look at the median instead and look at the deviation from that. Do grouping. Do some cross-sectional analysis. Do quartile analysis. And yes, we're going to discuss these things in detail in the second half of the talk. Do some correlation matrices. Look at your trending. And don't be afraid to use measurements from one control to measure the effectiveness of another. One of my favorite things to do is to do exactly that. And I threw out one spam vendor because of measuring the effectiveness of my URL and my DNS filtering. And I got to see how much spam was coming through because of how they categorized the traffic. And I realized that I had a control that was failing. I also took a look at how frequently they were blocking good things and how frequently they were blocking bad things. And yeah, there was a vendor in trouble. Okay. Can I get the thing to advance? Yes, advance. Now, averages are mean. They are not really a good control. Sorry, not really a good value to analyze against. The trick is that they obscure more than they reveal. They give a false impression of what might be typical. And a great way to think about this thing is the average intelligence of an individual who does not believe vaccines work. They are of average intelligence. Now, think about all the people who are below average. A little sobering. So, average is not necessarily typical. It's sometimes a statistical anomaly. Be very careful in using averages. By the way, I'm not exactly certain where I am in time in terms of, I know you've got a break in here. So
we're at 2:48. So if you had a few more slides, we can end earlier. We can end at 3 for the break.
Yeah, sounds good.
And then we normally have a 10 to 15 minute break or so.
Yep, that will give me a chance to let my voice rest. And I have, as you can see, quite a few slides. All right.
Do you want me to ping you at 3 o'clock, or you?
Yeah,
do you have a clock here?
No, I have a watch, but obviously I'm not watching it.
Okay, I'll interrupt at 3. Thank you.
All right. Medians are a much better way of looking at what a typical number is. The median is that value where half the data is above it and half the data is below it. It will give you a more valuable measurement point than your average or your mean. The smaller the deviation, the closer your number is to the mean. The larger the deviation, the further away it is from the mean. So when you see a number that is small, you get a clustering of data. And if you're looking at normative behaviors, that's exactly what you want. So when you're doing user behavior analytics, you want to look for data that has a high standard deviation from the mean. And then you are seeing atypical behavior. That's behavior you want to look at very carefully. To calculate a standard deviation, it's a very simple thing to do. You take the mean. For each element, you square the distance between it and the mean. Add up the squares and divide by the number of elements. You take the square root of this, and that's your standard deviation. If you're doing it formally, it's expressed by a value or a sigma. And you've all heard the expression of 6 sigma. Well, that comes from the percentage of data elements that fall within 6 standard deviations of the mean, which is 99.9997% in a normal distribution, if you think of a bell curve here. Very few people can get to 100%. If you take a look at the cloud security, the Center for Internet Security's critical security control metrics, they're all about achieving 6 sigma standard deviation in the rollout or deployment of their controls as a way of measuring the effectiveness. So they're asking you to do this as you count how many things you have done for each one of their controls. And a high standard deviation with certain values, such as user behavior analytics as an example again, might be an indication that something is amiss and should be investigated. So this is an important analysis technique to understand and to work with. Okay. Grouping and aggregation. This is kind of fun to do against various different logical categories. And then you want to group on the basis of what gives you the most meaningful information about it. Sometimes you want to count and get the sum. Sometimes you want to get the mean. Sometimes you want to get the standard deviation. But often you want to know what the highest value is or the lowest value is. And sometimes you want to have a full sum of all the events. So these are all different ways of grouping and aggregating data that can add a lot of value. Okay, now quartile is a lovely way of breaking things down into groupings and can be very, very informative. The first quartile is the best 25%. The second quartile is the top 50%, so it contains the first quartile. The third quartile is the top 75%, so it contains the first and the second quartiles. And the fourth quartile is the worst 25%. So unlike the third, which contains everything above it, the fourth does not contain 100% of the values. The fourth is everything left over. The dividing number between the second and third is your median. This form of analysis clusters performers very, very effectively, and is often a great way to visualize your information. And we really should be thinking about, when we're doing analysis, of what kind of visualizations we can get out of this. And so I'm going to stop there, even though it's 7 minutes before I think the agreed upon break time. And when we come back, I'm going to talk a bit about different ways to visually represent your data. All right?
That sounds perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay, so I'm going to just stop sharing here, if I can remember how to do that in Zoom. There we go.
Sounds good. And
put myself on mute and take a step away. I'll be back. You said it was 15 minutes?
Yeah, we'll meet around 3:15. Feel free, everyone, to take a coffee break or grab some food, and we have some questions in the chat. If you would prefer to do a Q&A at the end, or
yeah, I had forgotten all about Q&A, and you're absolutely right. I should cover questions. How about we take now, before we do our break, to cover Q&A. See if I can find the chat. There it is. All right.
And I can read out some as well. The first question we had actually was around, one person had asked if there was a transcript or if they could have if we get a copy of the PowerPoint, and that's up to you, of course.
Absolutely. I'd be happy to share this PowerPoint when I'm done. And by the way, I'm horrified because as I've been talking, I've been remembering that I never did put in a slide on, um, what was it again? Losing my mind here, so I really need that break. On, oh God. It's something in the agenda, and I forgot exactly what, but I missed a slide. So I'm hoping to be able to put it in between now and the break. So the slide deck that I will distribute will have more than I'm going to speak to. That's all I'll say. And once I remember what I forgot, then I'll put it in there. What's the next
Awesome.
question?
Feel free if anyone wanted to speak up, or I can read out the questions.
Reading out the questions will help me.
Perfect. Okay, so I'll read the next one. So one person asked, what is a realistic metric for alerts to incident? Example, 50% alerts become incidents, or manual actions taken by analysts.
I think that's
yeah.
a great starting point at 50%. That means that 50% of your alerts are false positives. But what it tells you is that your analyst team are immature. They don't know how to identify what is worth investigating and what isn't, and that your alerting system is immature. It doesn't know how to differentiate between things that look bad and things that really are. So it's an opportunity to tune things up. And so that might be a realistic starting place. You never want that to be your goal. You always want to set a goal that is better than that. Over the past, I've been tracking this particular metric over the past 8 months with my team. And the best we have done is 95% of the alerts we responded to were resulted in corrective actions on our part in response to the investigation. So we had a 5% false positive rate. The worst we have done is 50%. And so when I see a 50% number, I ask myself, how can I tune my alerts? How can I train my team to be better at identifying things and at creating better alerts? That's what that number tells me.
So do you think starting at a realistic number and then adjusting as your team meets those goals to have more of a pie in the sky number is like a better approach?
I would not agree with that. No, I think you want to start with pie in the sky and build towards it. If you start out with something that's realistic, where's the urgency to fix it? It's not coming from you. It's maybe coming from people above you are saying, why are you so bad? But they won't know it's bad because they're taking from you. Maybe this is the best you can do. So you never want to start out with where you are as terms of your goals. You want to set your goals to be more advanced than where you are, so you have something to strive for. Otherwise, you're not striving for continuous improvement. You've identified that where you are is the best you can be. And at that point, you have to ask the uncomfortable question of, is this really the best I can be? And the ever more question of, if this is the best I can be, why am I bothering to measure it?
Awesome, thank you.
I think just a quick follow-up on that one. It's the reason why I asked this is the context behind that is if 50% of your alerts are false positive, that means those are the ones that instead of taking manual actions by analysts, those should be completely automated.
Yes.
And if, it depends on the type of definition of your incident as well. A lot of people define as, if there's an impact, things like that. But I think in this context, I was referring to where a manual action has to be taken by an analyst to do something, like a block an IOC or, actually send out a communication or something like that, where he physically needs to type something in a keyboard to do something rather than, just seeing it from experience and saying, hey, this was false because, an admin was doing something which is legit and closing it out. So I think in that context.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way to refine your statement. And thank you for that. Obviously, these goals have to fit within your organization and they have to be appropriate for what you want to try to achieve. So if you are comfortable with that being something you're striving for, and you think that represents the best you can ever be, make those your numbers. I would argue you can do better than that. And if you're at 50% and you think that's the best you can be, start reporting against a goal of 60% and see if your team can improve to that. And then as they approach 60%, start to report against 70% and see if they can improve. Always set your goal ahead of where you are. Otherwise, you set the expectation that this is the best I expect out of you.
Yeah, that's right. That's what I was trying to ask the industry question, if there is, a standard or a publication around that sort of metric that can help you compare.
Yeah. Unfortunately, none of the standards really define things like that, because it's all a matter of what is effective risk management for you, and only you can know that. And I've seen things such as you want your dwell time to be 5 seconds or less to be an effective incident response program as a publicized metric. And I don't know whether or not that's actually achievable by anybody, because tracking that is awfully difficult. But that's an example of what you get when you look to the wider industry for metrics, is you get absurdities like that. So I would take a step back from looking where the industry is setting measurements and metrics and say, what is good risk management for my organization? What do I want to accomplish here? What does success look like for us? And put a line in the sand for that number. And then push for it. And if you achieve it, push for a better number. Redefine it. Because you can always get better.
Of course. Thank you. This is helpful.
Any other questions?
We had a question from Tanya. I can read out unless she wanted to speak up. She said, have you any suggestions in tackling the difficulty in communicating the value in metrics tracking, especially when this introduces additional efforts in tracking and reporting?
Yeah, just start doing it and show improvement over time from it. Or just start doing it and show how you can understand if control X is living up to your expectations, and maybe that's justification for replacing it with control Y, or perhaps vendor X with vendor Y, if you have an underperforming vendor. As you publish your metrics on a regular basis and show how they help you make decisions about what you're doing to make your program better, people will see the value of that. But use the numbers that you publish to help you make decisions on what to change to get better numbers. So if you have a spam provider that's blocking 5 business critical emails per quarter, that to me is a failing spam provider. And so the question becomes, what do you do about that spam provider? Do you spend time to adjust your spam filters with the spam provider, or do you spend time looking for an alternative spam provider? Those are the 2 possibilities. So you've defined what success is: 0 business impactful emails being blocked. You've measured deviation from that. You've defined a threshold beyond which deviation from that is too impactful to be acceptable. And now you take action from it. You show this over time regarding all of your controls and show how you are making decisions off of it to improve things. And you use this in your reporting to your leadership team, to your peers. They will appreciate what you're doing, but it's helping you make better decisions. That's the most important thing. Anything else?
Just me more curious than anything. Have you seen in your career companies measuring the impact of their tools consistently or accurately, or just actually keeping track of their metrics?
Both my current location and my prior company, I have done so.
Mhm.
At Metricon, last Metricon we had was Metricon 10. There were a number of my peers who were there who were doing similar. And that's one of the things, one of the reasons why we gathered was to discuss, okay, we've been discussing security metrics for 10 years. Do we have some success stories out of it? So we came together to talk about exactly that. And so it was 2 days filled of people discussing how they were using metrics in order to improve security within their organization and or industry. I highly encourage you to look up the Metricon conference. Securitymetrics.org hosts all the materials, and I believe all the presentations are up there, if I remember correctly. If not, just I'm certain if you ping Justin Peavy, he can get you some insight into all of what we did those 2 days. That was back in 2019, if I remember correctly. And we talked about in a couple of years coming back together again, the security metrics community. But a small thing like a pandemic has gotten in the way of any hopes of that.
So is securitymetrics.org?
If I'm remembering correctly, yes.
Awesome,
I've got the
thank you.
link to that on my last slide. So
Perfect.
I encourage you to not depend upon my memory for details like that. I've earned the gray in my beard, honestly.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
It's about the value to show the value of a secure program, especially to the board members, upper management. Do you have any recommendation? Like what kinds of metrics you can use?
Yes, I do, and I will get to that later in the presentation. So okay. I'm gonna ask me again if you don't understand that when I've got to the end of the second half.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So we have certainly gone past the break hour.
Okay, cool.
So all right. I think James is very glad to take a break at this point, if I understood that properly. So let's all take that 15-minute break. I know I desperately need it, and I'll see you back. I guess that would be like 20 after at this point, or 20 something after?
Yep, that sounds about right. So we'll meet at 3:20 or so.
Sounds good. See you all then.
See you. So on my computer, we just hit 3:20. So I believe you can start again, Walter. We'll leave the rest of the questions probably for the end of the meeting, just not to, push back the time any longer.
Sounds good. Good
Thank
afternoon,
you.
everybody. Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed your break from my talking as much as I enjoyed my break from talking. Correlation matrices are a great way of looking at data as it relates to other data to put it in context and get some information out of it. This is a great example. It comes from the Scientia report that basically refutes the idea that the Poneman cost data breach report gives us anything meaningful of value. And they do that by correlating a larger data set against the Poneman data set to place it into a larger context. And you can do that within your own organization to put your data in a larger context in a variety of different ways. It could be a time-bound issue. It could be before and after a change kind of issue. It requires a little bit of creativity to put data into a context to get information out of it. Experiment. Don't be afraid to try different ways to approach understanding how your data gives you information. Correlation is a great approach to doing that. Okay. Time series data. Tracking each metric or each measurement, if you will, over time. And frankly, you could do both. Line charts are a great way to show the information about your data in this particular way. This particular line chart shows Breach rates amongst Fortune 1000. Again, it comes from a Scientia report. And you'll notice right within it, they've got a median line that, sorry, yeah, no, I believe it's a median line that shows you the deviation from before and after a particular point in time, but also as the rate goes up and down. Okay. Now, you want your metrics to tell a story. And so simply expressing it as a set of numbers is often not a good way to help people understand what it is your metric does. So this is a good example of using your metric to tell a story from the same metric we constructed earlier. So if we say that no more than 20% of the controls that we have implemented to prevent a data breach from somebody clicking on a link in a fish, so no more than 20% of those controls are less than 95% completely deployed in our production environment. And at the current rate of deployment, we'll achieve 100% for 80% or more of those in-scope controls within the quarter. All of those controls are operating within a standard deviation of no more than 6 from the mean of expected behavior. So we are not seeing any unacceptable adverse impact from these controls. There has been an unexpected rise in the volume of malware, however, that was quarantined by our EDR. So it looks like our anti-spam and our DNS filtering and URL filtering are all underperforming. So we need to do some further analysis to look at which one of the three is underperforming below our thresholds and take action. Otherwise, the controls that we've selected for managing for this threat scenario of our risk of a compromise of confidentiality are operating effectively. So in this paragraph, and it could be written out as a paragraph or as a bulleted list like I've done here, we've reported on completeness, we've reported on impact, we've reported on effectiveness through telling a story. And so we've well surpassed taking numbers that are data and turned it into information within a context. Now, different controls are implemented for each threat scenario. And so you want to build up metrics that report relative to each one of your threat scenarios. It takes time to build this together, and it's well worth the effort once you have it done. You construct the algorithms from your measurements for all appropriate controls. And that allows you to report if the controls in scope for that risk scenario are completely implemented, operating effectively, and without adverse impact. And having done all of that, it's not enough, not ideally. You want to take a look at, and this is homework for everybody. You want to sit down, buy and read a book of a friend of mine and his colleague. Gary Henson is somebody I've known for a number of years. He and I butt heads every now and then on some lists we're part of, but I have full respect for him and his accomplishments. And he and W. Craig Brotby put together a book called Pragmatic Metrics, where they are looking to measure on a meta basis whether or not the metrics you create are pragmatic. In other words, are they predictive? Can you forecast future results based upon the metrics you're collecting? Are they relevant? If they're not relevant to a risk scenario, why are you bothering to collect it? Is a very good question, and it's one that you should know. Are they actionable? Can you do something about it? And if you can't do something about it, again, why are you collecting it? Is it genuine? You'd be amazed at how often the numbers that you get from your tools are not genuine. I look back to the issue of TCP/IP logs versus UDP logs. If you start reporting on incident rates based upon UDP log collection, your numbers are not genuine because you're not collecting all of your logs. You've got some problems there. I've got some problems. Are the numbers meaningful? Do they tell a story? Is your metric telling a good story like the one we discussed on the prior slide? Are they accurate? I've actually seen a vendor's set of numbers about vulnerabilities that upon doing some analysis, I discovered that they were inaccurate, and I needed to open up a ticket with the vendor. So do double check that the values you're getting are accurate through other techniques. Are they timely? Are you getting these things frequently enough and close enough to the event, if it's event-based, where you can act on what you're seeing? Can anyone run the analysis and get the metric? Or does it have to be you? And if it has to be you, you're doing it wrong. You really want these things to be independent of you. And finally, are these things inexpensive enough to do? And if they're not, you're probably approaching it wrong. You want your metrics to be cheap to gather and cheap to produce so that you can do it frequently and make decisions. The measuring is all nice, but it's there to support decisions. It's not there to just be numbers for numbers' sake. So you want to spend your time doing other things, not just gathering numbers. It's a great book. I highly recommend it. Now, most important out of all of that is if the results are who cares, don't do it, don't track it. Only track the metrics that are actionable, just like you only want to get alerts that are actionable. First, the fourth day on my current job, I was woken up about 3 in the morning from the vendor, the MDR company that we were using at the time. You've been scanned for by somebody on the internet to see if your website is vulnerable. My response to the analyst on the phone was, did they get through our defenses? No, they scanned you. That's very nice. Was their attack successful? No, but they scanned you. Okay, that's going to happen every single day of my life. Never call me about this again. When I got the same phone call 2 days later, I fired the vendor. It's an alert that's not actionable, and I frankly value my sleep more than I value alerts that are not actionable, and I hope you all do the same. Now, reporting is a matter of understanding who cares, and there has to be somebody who cares or you don't bother collecting it. But some metrics are best reported to your staff. Some metrics are best reported to your peers, others to senior management. And when it comes to talking to the board, they only care about what are the risks, and at an abstract level, how effective are you at managing them? So a high level of how you're doing against what is it that you're at risk for. Now, every picture tells a story, and a tree map is a great way to represent complex relational data so that you can see easily see the volume of the problem. Here we have one that will show potentially vulnerabilities across multiple hosts on TCP ports versus UDP ports by volume. And the host one would have the most number of vulnerabilities of the 4 hosts that we have in our sample. And host 3 has the least amount of vulnerabilities in our sample, especially on UDP side. And as you can see, TCP vulnerabilities tend to outclass UDP vulnerabilities. And I didn't do a very good job on putting together this tree map because I have 2 different kinds of TCP vulnerabilities there. So I needed to do a little bit of work on this tree map so that it's more effectively communicating. But tree maps are a wonderful, wonderful way of showing the relationships between different data sets. I would encourage you to investigate their use. There's a brilliant free tool out there that helps you construct tree maps. Check it out. Box charts. Box charts are something that you can do in Excel. They're a very effective way of showing minimums, maximums, means, and medians in one fell swoop. And so you can show here, this would be a great chart to take to your board of directors or to your senior executive team, where you could show at an aggregate for all the different risk scenarios, what are the potential impacts at a minimum, maximum, mean, and medium for each kind of risk. Now, Because you have multiple scenarios, one scenario will give you a higher impact, another scenario will give you a lower impact. So you're showing a range of potential impacts here. And obviously, this is a great way of explaining to your board in one picture entire range of possibilities for the 7 scenarios that, or the 7 risk cases that we identified earlier. Pie charts are wonderful and problematic. Can anyone tell me if the blue or the gray, the blue or the orange slice is bigger than the other? Not from the picture by itself. You need a label here that gives you the percentage. And that's the problem with a pie chart, is that as a way of representing percentages, it requires labeling in order to be effective. And you want your visualizations to be able to tell an effective story without that kind of labeling. You notice that this one here has no labeling. I don't need somebody to draw a line and say the lower bound potential impact for our environment against integrity is underneath $10 million. You can see that readily just by glancing at the chart. Here, you can't tell anything about this data unless you put in specific labeling. Now, some people think that donut charts are a better way of doing pie charts than pie charts themselves. And you notice I've added in for this particular donut chart the labeling. You'll also see that there's a couple of slices on the donut that are not labeled, and that's just a problem with the engine that I use to generate this chart. This one, by the way, comes out of my seam, and this happens to be one of the charts I use in order to understand the nature of the attacks that are being launched against one of my business applications. This is a metric that I can't directly do something about. It's telling me something about the strategies that are being used to attack me. And so I can use this information to make certain that I am prioritizing my defenses properly. So it is actionable indirectly. This is another way of looking at the same kind of data, but correlated against a slightly different data set. So bar charts allow me to do that much more effectively than pie charts, because they can pack more information into the same amount of space. So here I can see the breakdown of attacks against my environment that are being blocked per location of the attack. And so I can see that most of the people who are attacking my company come from the United States, and that they are using the attacks that you see. Now, I'm not going to tell you which application this is going after. That's a bit far too much information, but this is stuff we're blocking. And it's important to know how people are attacking us, and it's good to know that our defenses are up to this. And it's amusing to note that the .NET nuke attack is the most effective attack against us, considering this is not a .NET application. So that particular group of people is a bunch of script kiddies. It's helpful to know who your adversaries are. Another way of looking at, again, attack data is to spread it out over a map. And so here I can see volumes based upon source locations. And what's interesting is that the lion's share of the attacks against our organization are coming from 2 distinct locations within North America. But otherwise, they're fairly well distributed across the globe. You see some isolated spots here and there where we have less attacks coming from us, or more attacks. What I find personally interesting is how many attacks are coming from locations that are the islands, in either the Atlantic or the Pacific or the Indian Ocean. Those are rather real locations, and they can be just as aggressive as somebody in Poland, where I can see that there's a decent amount of attacks coming from, that looks to be Warsaw. Fairly large circle, what looks to be Boston, fairly large circle, what looks to be Chicago and San Francisco. It's informative. This one is less actionable. or so you would think. But what this tells me is that if I have a strategy of should I be blocking by geographic location because after all, China is so very aggressive or Russia is so very aggressive, as you see in the presses, well, here I can demonstrate to my leadership team, my peers, that for our organization, we'd have to be blocking the United States in order to be blocking the people who are attacking us most frequently. And so blocking based upon geolocation is probably not going to be a viable strategy, because that also happens to be exactly where most of our customers are located. So it tells us something about the nature of our defenses. That's important to understand. Now, there are certain ways of visualizing data that actually takes away meaning. This is the same pie chart, but we've added to it a third dimension in order to make it cool. And in making it cool, we take away meaning. Now it becomes impossible to tell if gray or orange is bigger without labels. Now, 2D column charts are awesome. Even without color and labels, I can see relative values. You add a third dimension to that, and this same chart that is so clear here, it's the same numeric set. I can see in the prior chart exactly where the numbers line up. Here, it's impossible to tell without squinting. Please don't use 3 dimensions in your charts this way to just make it cooler. It takes away value. If you're going to use 3-dimensionality, size is a great way to look at your data sets. So here I can see, again, .NET Nuke is the biggest of all the different bubbles in my bubble chart. And so it's the most commonly used attack pattern. And I can see that MySQL, SQLi, executable comments are much smaller. Now, it's important to know that people are doing things such as hitting us up with a MySQL attack. But in terms of this, very effectively shows, as a better way of saying this, the relative value of each one of these attack patterns just by using a different dimension. And here it's the dimension of size. Now, reporting risk. You'll see a lot of industry literature about using heat maps to report risk, tracking impact against likelihood. And even if you're treating them as separate and independent factors, as I am, you can still put it on a chart of impact versus likelihood. Well, first of all, if you're gonna do a heat map, don't use abstract categories like low, medium, high, very high. They tell no story. What makes it very high? Or maybe make it a 10, 9, 8, 7, cardinal numbers. Okay, what makes it a 10? What makes it an 8? If you do likelihood in percentages, if you do impact in dollars, well, then maybe a heat map can tell you something. Now the colors are adding a third dimension that may or may not be important. But if you make your likelihood a percentage of 0% all the way through 100%, and you chart against that, if you make your impact from $0 all the way through the biggest possible impact to your organization, let's say it's $10 billion, just to pick a number out of a hat, then maybe a heat map can become a good way to visually represent the data. But I would recommend that you consider this as an alternative, if I can get my computer to respond here. All right. This is looking at risk scenarios, and there are 4 of them represented. You can see very clearly what the potential impact estimation is in terms of annualized loss. You can see very clearly what initiatives are being taken in order to reduce that. You can see that this is against certain asset classes. And you can see here the top risk scenarios in terms of percentage and impact, tracked independent of each other, but shown in a related fashion. It's a little bit more screen real estate than this chart here, but you're getting a lot more bang for your screen real estate, and it's a lot more understandable in terms of reporting to senior management, in terms of reporting to a board of directors. The problem with this particular chart that I see is it's representing the data as if they're absolutes, and these numbers are often not. They're often on a scale. And this is what I mean by on a scale. Percentage of impact is different per impact level. So you might have close to 100% chance of a $1,000 impact, but from looking at it, about a 40% chance of a $50,000 impact versus about a 10% chance of a $60,000 impact. Your board of directors will understand this and get a lot of value out of this. And what you're showing is that because different impacts have different percentages, you can understand what point your risk acceptance threshold should be based upon the probability of loss, perhaps. So since the probability of a loss of over $70,000 here is next to nothing, it looks like your risk acceptance threshold should be somewhere beneath $70,000, but above $60,000. And if you set it there in your risk analysis, you now know what's a tenable risk and what's an untenable risk, and you can take action on that. And so reporting risk like this, again, facilitates decision-making very effectively. Now, that's not to say that you will never have a potential data breach that's 95.4 thousand in your organization. That's just saying that the event frequency of such a thing is small enough where you should probably be expecting that if you have an impactful event, that the number will be smaller. And of course, that's a higher percentage because your controls are good enough in order to keep an impactful event having a smaller dollar amount. If you want to make it smaller, more controls. I forgot to put in slides and discussions on balanced scorecards. And when I was taking a look at our agenda earlier in the conversation, I realized that. And by the time I got to the point where saying, you know, I forgot to put a slide here, or two or three, of course, balanced scorecards are fairly complex. I simply forgot what it was I was supposed to put in. I couldn't remember the name. So during my break, I went through it. I went back to the agenda. That's what I forgot. So I will be adding this back in. There is some great resources out there that you can do this for yourself if you're impatient. But I want to be honest that I simply forgot this one. If you want to take it past where I've taken this to, there are some really, really excellent resources out there. First of all, securitymetrics.org is a good community. There is a mailing list. It's a little quiet at the moment, but has been periodically quiet and noisy in the past. Some really, really smart people on the list, though. So if you have questions, I'd be very happy to answer them. The Society of Information Risk, or SIRA, is a great organization also to be part of. Unfortunately, they don't have a mailing list so much as they have a Slack community, and they kind of have a mailing list. Again, I would join both organizations, contribute, be part of. The Security Metrics organization meets every so many years. The Society of Information Risk Analysts meets about once a year. They have a conference. Their most recent conference was this past August, and it was extremely valuable. There are some great books that I've read on these topics and has helped my career grow. It all started with Andrew Jack's Security Metrics book. It's a little out of date at this point, but definitely worth a read. George Campbell's Measures and Metrics in Corporate Security is actually out in 2 volumes, fairly small, but very, very useful. If you're beginning at this stuff, you can't get better than reading Carolyn Wong's guide to security metrics. Doug Hubbard, who's a known statistician, and Richard Searson, brilliant CISO, put together How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity Risk. Highly recommend that you read through this. It helps you understand how to implement things like FAIR and how to report on it much more effectively than I've been able to discuss. Richard Searson's got a book coming out early next year that he's calling the Metrics Manifesto that I'm very excited for. And you can pre-order it now on Amazon or Barnes & Noble or, of course, the publisher's website. I already mentioned Brotby and Hinson's Pragmatic Security Metrics. W. Craig Brotby's also got another book out there on just security metrics themselves. Win Schwartau's Analog Network Security is a self-published effort from a very, very brilliant individual who took a good critical look at information security. I highly recommend his book. And finally, last but not least, Jack Jones's and Jack Troyne's Measuring and Managing Information Security Risk is phenomenal and a must read. They have there's a different volume out there that gets all into how you can use programming in the R language, which is a statistical language, to do some of the complex stuff. But there's some free tools out there that you can use instead of learning to develop in R to do the same kind of analysis without having to spend a dime. Now, this is where I had planned to break for questions, and obviously we've still got some time for those questions, I think. So are there any further questions based upon how to communicate about metrics?
I don't have a question, but I just want to thank you, Walter, for this great talk. This is the best talk on the metrics I ever heard.
Yang, thank you so much. I'm quite honored by your statement. Thank you.
Thanks.
I usually understand silence as I've completely put my audience to sleep.
I wanted to add that Sarah actually has free webinars once a month. I've been a member for years, and they're really good.
I agree with you, and I'd forgotten about that, so thank you. They are really good. There's also the FAIR Institute, which is all about a specific way of understanding and managing and measuring risk. They're a bit more geared towards one understanding of risk rather than the entire problem. They are going to be having their conference. I believe it's all virtual this year, and it's in October, and it's free. So I would encourage you to think about that too. I had forgotten about the FAIR Institute when I put this all together.
Hey, Walt, David here. Just
yes, David.
Jumping in to say this is an interesting, different context in which to encounter you. I usually run into you in a different one.
Yep.
But I've really enjoyed this, and it's shed some light on some things that I'm doing right now in my job that could probably be improved by correct application of the principles. I look forward to the slides.
Because I'm traveling.
Talk about your blog too.
Yes. I've been blogging on and off about information security metrics for a number of years, and for the longest time it was off. I just needed to take some time away from the blog to collect my thoughts. But when the Cloud Security Alliance published their version 4 of their cloud controls, I took a look at it and said, they've got 4 places in their control set where they mandate metrics. Why only 4? And is there a meaningful way of taking a look at measuring the rest of what's in the cloud control matrix? So I've been going, there are 17 control families in the cloud controls matrix. I've been going through them one at a time on a somewhat weekly basis and looking at, is there a way to measure what the controls that they've put into the CCM. Now, what's interesting about the cloud control matrix is that it's somewhat like 27.1, not like 27.2. It's policy and procedure oriented rather than something like PCI DSS, which is you must have a firewall. And so it's a little bit more difficult to measure a policy. Do you count how many policies do you have? Do you count how many lines are in a policy? Gary has tweaked my nose a little bit with, well, you could take a look at how readable your policy is by looking at the grammar stats and use that as a meaningful metric. Is your policy written for a 4-year-old or a 14-year-old or a 24-year-old or somebody with a law degree? And he's right, that might be a very effective way of looking at metrics if you believe that those values reflect reality in any meaningful way. It almost doesn't matter if you find value in them, if you can use them to improve. That is a way of finding value even if you don't believe the silly grammatical analysis that Word does in your documents.
I mean, I believe policies are valuable in proportion to the extent you get useful standards and then actual procedures and guidelines that result in implementing better controls.
That's a great way to look at it. You know, John, I'm gonna throw at you another way to look at policy. Policies can also be measured in terms of how many policy violations have you had,
or how many exceptions have you had to process.
Exactly. And both of those things will tell you a story about the effectiveness of your policy, and not necessarily in a way that you want to understand, but it's important to understand. If you have a lot of policy violations, your policies are usually poorly written. If you have a lot of exceptions to your policy, they certainly are poorly written for your organization.
Yep, agree.
Yep. And so those would be potential metrics that you could throw out for policy or process.
The problem with those is the policy has to be in place for a pretty long time, influencing a lot of other stuff before you get a feel for what those magnitudes are and if you're in a good or bad zone with them.
Yes, very much so. And the other thing is you have to track the data. Have to imagine that a lot of human resources departments are not tracking policy violations.
No, but information security departments are tracking exceptions because they're having to deal with the whole bureaucratic method of whatever it is of getting them approved or rejected.
Some organizations do, others don't.
Sometimes, I think larger organizations are going to tend to do that bureaucratically.
Yeah, David, I would agree with you there. I think that the size of the organization dictates things like that, but those are certainly good potential metrics for your organization.
Yep. Cool.
Yep.
Anyway,
thank you,
great
John.
talk. Thanks.
Thank you, David. Anyone else? I deliberately left time here for discussion, and I'm a bit discouraged by the lack of it. So I hope that this is because you're all just thinking deeply about this.
So Walter, this is John Glover. I'm over on Main Island, and unfortunately I came on board late. But your concept of metrics, I'm very sort of hot on that topic myself.
Excellent.
And I believe that if you can't come up with metrics that everybody will agree with and embrace, then you have a lot of difficulty in monitoring, measuring, and reporting. And that seems to be a real knockoff for a lot of organizations.
I agree with you. I think you also have a large problem with understanding how you can improve things. how to make it better.
Yeah, I'd be very interested in following what you've done thus far in Cloud Control Matrix Metrics.
You'll find that some of the blog entries are mind-numbingly boring and others actually have some interesting things to it. The most recent one is probably the best, and it was somewhat influenced by putting together this talk, so you'll recognize some of the things in there.
I understand that you're going to be providing the slide set.
Yes, I am. And
good, I can get caught up then.
Yep, and I will be providing the slide set after I've taken the opportunity to put in the slides I forgot to put in on balanced scorecards as a way of reporting metrics.
Good, and the other issue too is that I hope that you will put in the URLs for your blog site.
That's in there.
Is it? Good.
Yes, it's actually on the very last slide, informationsecuritymetrics.wordpress.com. Also, if you care to follow me, I pretty much put the same things in LinkedIn. And I don't tweet. I don't tweet often, but I do tweet.
It's just as well. There are too many birds tweeting around here anyway.
Yeah. Twitter is a great way to vent.
Yeah, but unfortunately, it's also a great way to generate a lot of misinformation and disinformation, as we've seen.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. No, yeah. You have to be very good in your, what's the right way to phrase this? You just have to be very good in discerning fact from fiction. And if you want to learn more about that, there's a brilliant book that was put out, Open Source Intelligence Techniques. It's a self-published work that really gets into the details of resourcing and researching and analyzing online information. Michael Bazell put it together. It's a bit of a brick. Highly recommend that if you want to understand better how to utilize intelligence techniques to discern the difference between intelligence versus information versus data versus misinformation, misdirection of information, etc., that you read through this book. It's extremely important for threat hunting, extremely important for understanding the threat actors that are out there, both against your organization and on a larger geopolitical context. Anybody else? Questions, concerns?
Hey, hi, it's Fabrice from Joe Comply. I do have a question. So I'm a fairly freshly appointed CISO, and I'm in the situation where now I need to prepare some reporting to the board level. So I already have my reporting for like the C level, but I feel that's already probably going to be too detailed for one step above. Is there any resources you recommend to be able to cherry pick the right metric for that type of audience?
Stay away from Gartner. They've got some things that they put out there that are designed to do this, and it's pretty bankrupt from my encountering of it. Look at the RSA conference the past few years has had some really dynamite presentations on exactly that issue, on how to report to the board and what the board of directors is looking for from a variety of different perspectives on the subject. So I believe that those presentations are made available at some point after the RSA conference. If they're not, then I would encourage you to attend next year's RSA conference, but pay for it when it becomes available right away. First of all, it'll be much cheaper that way, but it will get you access to the conference materials from prior year's conferences. And so you can mine that for some really, really brilliant presentations on how to do that effectively.
Okay, thank you. We'll look it up.